In this lecture, we're going to talk about the muscid flies. These would be the house flies, face flies, stable flies, horn flies. And just as a reminder, they're in the suborder Cyclorapha, so they have aerostate antennae. So that means there's 3 segments of different shapes. The third segment is the largest, and from the third segment, a bristle-like structure called the arista arises. The larvae are without a differentiated head. In this group, the larvae are really what we would think of as maggots. The pupa is enclosed in a hardened larval skin, the puparium, and these are the tsetse flies and the house flies. Within the group muscidae, the most infamous member is probably Musca domestica, the housefly. Understanding the breeding cycle of flies is important to control. Each female lives about 1 month and lays 5 to 6 batches of 100 or more eggs. In warm weather, they complete the life cycle in just a week. So let's do some math. You start out with a pair of flies in April. Let's call them Brad and Angelina. By August, if all of their offspring lived and went on to have offspring of their own that lived, you would have 191 quintillion 10 quadrillion flies, or that's 191,000 times 10 to the 15th. That would be enough flies to cover the earth 47 feet deep. Clearly, though, that's not the case. This is the opposite kind of reproductive strategy than what we saw with the tsetse flies. In this case, the female produces many, many offspring, and very few of them survive. The eggs are laid in many different substrates. They do breed commonly in the dung of herbivores. It's thought that that's the ancestral breeding site, but they now breed in a wide variety of herbivore and fowl dung, but also fermenting kitchen waste, garbage, all kinds of decomposing organic matter. They can develop in association with stabled animals. They can breed in urine and dung-contaminated straw. But one thing, it may sound like they're not that picky, but actually houseflies do draw the line somewhere. They do not breed in cow manure. So good to see they have their standards. They will go through the life cycle. They have the 3 larval instars, and then the third instar larva, when it reaches the mature stage of the third larval instar, they tend to start moving around. So when it's a pre-pupa, they'll move, and they'll move up to drier locations, and that's where it'll pupate, and they'll form the puparium. And they'll overwinter as larvae and pupae, but they can be damaging. They cause dark spots on walls and ceilings and things. It's what we call fly specks. And fly specks are actually vomit and fecal material, so that just makes it even grosser. They have preferred resting areas near food sources and egg-laying areas. And here you can see the adult fly emerging from the puparium. Remember, the puparium is the hardened skin of the third larval instar. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see that the head seems to extend quite a bit anterior to the eyes. Well, that is the talinum. That's a structure that fills up with hemolymph. The fly will constrict all of its muscles to put pressure on the hemolymph, and when you put pressure on a liquid, it has to move somewhere, so it moves forward, and it pops out this membranous structure called the talinum, and that's used to pop off the end of the puparium. Once the fly is out and it relaxes the muscles, the hemolymph goes back into its normal places in the thorax and abdomen, and the talinum is retracted into the head and is never used again. The puparium can be an overwintering stage. When we look at medical and veterinary importance, they're found to transmit over 65 pathogens, including helminths, protozoans, bacteria, and viruses. The mechanism for transmission is generally mechanical. They get involved in fecal-oral contaminative routes. They've got great potential to contribute to this mode of transmission because they move readily from feces to food. Agents that they transmit do not rely on flies for their transmission. This just provides a supplement. So the pathogens that they're transmitting, they may just get on the surface of the fly and be carried around. Sometimes the fly may regurgitate them, and they can even ingest the flies and then defecate the pathogen. But in general, with these kinds of pathogens, even when the fly ingests them, it doesn't actually infect or replicate in the fly. It just moves through their digestive tract, and that's why it remains to be considered mechanical. But they can be biological vectors as well, and an interesting example of that would be the stomach worm of horses. And this would be Habronema species. And Habronema are adult worms in the stomach of the horse. They form nodules, and you can get really dense populations of adult worms in the stomach, and that can cause inflammation or colic in the horse. They have an interesting kind of life cycle, because what happens is the fly will come and deposit the worm larvae on the horse's lips, and that's how they ingest them. But they can also cause external infections called summer sores, and you can see pictures of these here, one up by the mouth of the horse and one down by a hoof. Because what happens here is that the worm larvae in skin can't complete development. They have to be ingested and make their way into the stomach of the horse to complete their developmental cycle. But they can survive for quite a while, sometimes as much as 6 months in the skin. So what we start to see on these horses are sores that are difficult to treat, that just won't heal. And that is a tip-off that what you're dealing with is a summer sore, and it requires an anti-helminthic treatment. So here's the whole life cycle. The adult worms, remember, are in the stomach of the horse. They mate. The eggs are passed out in the feces. The fly larvae in the feces ingest the eggs. The eggs hatch into maggots and remain as larval worms while the fly matures to adult. And then the adult fly will then go and deposit the L3 larvae that have developed within them, and they'll deposit it preferentially around the mouth of the horse, and then the horse will ingest the larvae, and you have the development completed this way. But in terms of fly prevention, some of the best ways is to stack manure so that it dries out. You can use insecticides. That can also be useful for control. Skin breaks on the horse should be avoided during fly season, and existing wounds should be treated with fly repellents, because if the horse has an open wound, that's going to attract the flies in. They'll deposit the L3 larvae, and although you won't get the completion of the Habronema life cycle, you will get a summer sore. The cutaneous lesion can be treated, or if it's small, it can even be surgically removed. A close cousin of the housefly would be the facefly, Musca autumnalis. These tend to be pests of horses, cattle, and open-faced sheep. The flies originated from Europe. They first showed up in North America in Nova Scotia in 1951, and they're now widely distributed throughout the U.S. They like fresh manure. Oh, by the way, you may have noticed by now that we've been talking about feces, dung, manure a lot. Well, yeah, this lecture is sometimes referred to as the shit lecture. You're welcome. Okay, so this one likes fresh cattle manure, about 15 minutes old as the maximum, and they will breed in single droppings. The adults like bright sunlight, so these are pasture flies. They don't follow the animals into barns, and they're not problems in feedlots. But they're strong flyers, so they can move readily between separated herds. An interesting aspect to these is that the larvae are yellow and the puparium is white. All other manure-inhabiting flies have white maggots and brown puparia. So the next time you're out walking through a pasture, look for the yellow larvae. In terms of medical and veterinary significance, these flies cause a lot of annoyance to the animals they're feeding on. They're buzzing around their faces, feeding on facial secretions such as tears, saliva, and mucus, and they're getting protein from these secretions. So that creates a considerable amount of annoyance. Also, their mouth parts have small teeth for rasping, and this can create a wound to attract more flies or to provide an entrance for pathogens. The cattle bunch together. They seek shade. Remember, these flies like bright sunlight. And they'll stand in water to avoid the flies. All these avoidance behaviors interfere with normal grazing patterns. It's estimated that a population of about 15 flies per animal decreases grazing by 1 hour per day. But in addition to causing annoyance, they're also vectors. For instance, with pink eye, infectious bovine keratoconjunctivitis, we have a bacterial infection of the eye which causes inflammation and, in severe cases, temporary blindness. This pink eye is caused by a bacterium which produces a toxin. This toxin attacks the surface of the eye, the cornea, and the surrounding membranes, and it erodes the surface and causes severe inflammation. Face flies are important vectors of this bacterium. And here you can see what the pink eye can look like in a bad case. In addition, we have the eyeworm with Thalasia, which is a nematode. The adult nematodes reside in the conjunctival sac of the definitive host, where they release first instar larvae, or L1s. The L1 larvae are ingested by the face fly during its feeding. In the fly, the larvae molt twice to become infective L3 larvae. These fully developed L3 larvae will then migrate to the fly's mouthparts, where they remain until the fly feeds on the tears of a definitive host. There, in the conjunctival sac of the host, the worms will molt twice more and become adults. And here you can see what these worms look like in the eyes of the animal. Another group of flies that are important as pests in the muscids would be musca sorbens. These flies are common in the tropics and subtropics. Sometimes they're referred to as bush flies. They prefer human feces as their breeding medium. That's a really good breeding medium for musca sorbens, and they have found that larger and more numerous flies consistently emerge from human feces as compared to other animal excrement. Further research has also shown that these flies exhibit a preference for fresh, isolated human feces on the ground and will not breed in the liquefied excrement found in pit latrines. As a result, musca sorbens is favorably adapted to cohabitation with humans, especially in parts of the world lacking sewage systems or pit latrines in which people continue to defecate in open areas. But what we find with this fly is that it can become so numerous that people become habituated. So you see in this picture, this little kid is eating and he's just ignoring the flies because he's gotten used to them buzzing around his face. And that's a very bad thing because these flies are vectors of chlamydia trachomas, which causes the disease trachoma. Trachoma is an infection of the eye caused by chlamydia trachomitis, and it ranks worldwide as the most common preventable cause of blindness and the second most common cause of blindness after cataract. The disease is endemic in 48 countries, particularly in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. It is most prevalent in poor rural communities with lower standards of hygiene and sanitation. Infection results in a mild inflammation of the conjunctival lining of the inner eyelid surface. Single episodes of infection usually resolve without any permanent damage. With repeated episodes of infection, a chronic condition of conjunctivitis results. This leads to the formation of subepithelial follicles that are visible upon inspection of the inner lining of the upper eyelid. Eventually, chronic reinfection and conjunctival inflammation results in scarring. This is of particular clinical importance in the upper eyelid, where the scarred inner lining deforms the lid margin, causing the eyelid to fold inwards. Inversion of the upper eyelid brings the eyelashes in contact with the cornea of the eye, scratching the surface with each blink or movement of the eyelid. This is a painful condition that can lead to the development of opaque corneas and subsequent blindness. Here in this picture, you can see a normal conjunctiva at the top, a relatively minor case of inflammation, the beginning of follicles to form, and then you can see an intense case down at the bottom. And with this, you see the life cycle too, where flies are carrying that microorganism and deposits it around the eyes. Ways to avoid it can include things as simple as, washing faces and hands and so on to prevent the disease. But there's a really nice program to control trachoma. It's called the SAFE program. Working in 6 African countries to eliminate trachoma, the Carter Center, in partnership with the Lions Club, the Hilton Foundation, the International Trachoma Initiative, and Ministries of Health, helps to implement the WHO's SAFE strategy, and that includes surgery, antibiotics, face and hand washing, and environmental hygiene. Through efforts in parts of Africa, thousands of villages currently benefit from ongoing health education. And since 2002, the lead organization worldwide has focused on the environmental facet of strategy. The center has assisted in the construction of approximately 1.5 million household latrines to help reduce breeding sites for flies, because remember, they're an important source of the infection. The Carter Center also supports mass drug administration of antibiotics. The center also helps to train and equip health workers to surgically correct eyelids that have already been deformed by scarring from multiple infections. So this effort has been very successful. Here you can see, if you look to the bottom left, you see one of these latrines. And it's ideal for people who are illiterate. You go into the latrine, you can actually, there's actually a door to close, and you place your feet on the little foot imprints, and then you can see the cover with the handle. You pick up the cover, you take care of business, you put the cover back, and then you leave. And this safe program has been very effective at reducing trachoma. Another fly in this group would be Stomoxys calcitrans, the stable fly. They are sometimes referred to as the biting housefly. They look very much like houseflies, but they have mouth parts that project forward. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts, as opposed to the sponging type mouth parts that a housefly has. They're abundant in and around farm buildings, and particularly abundant in late summer. They were historically a pest of cattle and barns, but now they're becoming a pasture pest, where large hay bales are used. They like a habitat of manure mixed with straw, and they'll develop in decaying hay at the base of improperly stored bales. Both sexes will feed on blood, and they take many small meals several times a day, so they have a very strong pest impact. Their life cycle is several weeks depending on temperature. They can overwinter as larvae or pupae. They can be a particular problem in coastal areas like around Lake Superior or the New Jersey shores. In the northwest Florida beaches along the Panhandle, they can be a big problem from August to November because of the weather patterns. You have northerly winds associated with high pressure areas and cold fronts, and this brings the flies in from southern Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida farming areas. From a medical and veterinary significance, these flies can inflict painful bites. They're persistent and strong flyers, and they can follow the host for a considerable distance. They're common near barns, animal pens, and shade trees. They feed mostly on the legs, belly, and near the ears of the host. You can see here a number of flies feeding on this cow. They feed on the tips of dog ears where the hair isn't as dense, and that's why in some places they'll be referred to as dog flies. But they can irritate the animals so much that they've been known to stand in water up to their nose during heavy infestations. We see declines in production due to fatigue in the animals. Heavy infestations, 50 per animal, can lead to a reduction in weight gain by as much as 50% and a reduction in milk by about 40%. With Hematobia irritans, the horn fly, the eggs are laid in fresh cow manure, and they can complete their life cycle in 10 to 14 days. They prefer cattle, but you can also find them on horses. They look a lot like house flies, but they're about half the size, and they do have blood-sucking mouth parts. They cluster around the bases of horns, the shoulders, and the backs of the animals. But an interesting aspect of their life cycle is that the female leaves the host only to lay eggs. She'll mate and feed and move to the rear of the animal and wait for it to defecate. As defecation occurs, the female fly will go down to oviposit on the fresh dung. They prefer manure that is less than 2 minutes old, so they're very picky. They can lay about 500 eggs. The maggots develop best on grass-type manure from cattle on pastures. They do poorly on manure from cattle on concentrated feed. The pupae are the overwintering stage. The frost will kill the adults. These are the most damaging biting flies infecting cattle, and they're a particular problem on grazing beef cattle and feedlot cattle, as they can cause enormous losses. Both males and females blood feed, and they remain on the host, feeding intermittently 10 to 40 times per day for 10 minutes or so at a time. With each feeding, they withdraw and reinsert the mouth parts. This continual feeding causes pain and aggravation to the animal. Heavy infestations lead to a reduction in weight gain of as much as a half a pound per day, and milk production can be reduced 10 to 20%. Production is consistently lower on untreated animals. The cost of treatment is nominal compared to the increased production realized by treating. Okay, so this brings us to how do we control muscid flies? There's several different approaches that can be taken. One is cultural control. This is where you're reducing fly breeding. You dry manure, you get rid of wet straw. It's essentially a sanitation program, and this can be very effective, especially for house and stable flies. There's also biological control using things such as wasps and dung beetles. USDA is importing some exotics for use in this way, but they're still testing them before they can be released. Then there's mechanical control. Baited traps can be good for stable and house flies. Then you have walk-through traps where you put the trap in a spot where the animal has to pass through to get water or get to a salt lick. And strips of canvas can dislodge the flies, which are then collected in a cone trap. This can reduce hornfly populations by about 50%. But we also have insecticides. Face flies are probably the most difficult to control because they spend relatively little time on the animal. But face flies and horn flies lay their eggs in cow manure, and the larvae only develop in cow manure. Therefore, some of the compounds that are available can be fed or given in bolus form to the cow, and then it can kill the larvae in the manure pat. This can be very effective. Some of these products can be insecticides, but others can be insect growth regulators, which are safer and cross resistance doesn't develop. Some of these are just given as feed-throughs, so they just put them in the animal's feed, then they pass through the animal's gut, comes out with the feces, and then it will take care of the fly larvae, kill the fly larvae in the manure pat.